Thank you for making the effort for the early Saturday morning panel. We know it's not easy. My name is Richard Gisbert. I host a program on Al Jazeera English called The Listening Post. We cover media in all its forms. We've been doing the program since 2006, so we're 10 years into it now. And the Trump story, as a political story goes, with a media angle, it doesn't get any better than that. The title of this morning's session is American Journalism in the Trump Era. We have three very interesting and well-placed panelists today to help us through this. I'm going to get each of them to introduce themselves, starting with Cameron on my far left.
Good morning. I'm Cameron Barr. I'm managing editor at the Washington Post. Been at the Post
Push
for
the
about,
button.
It's on.
Yeah, I've been at the Post for about 13 years. Before that, I was a foreign correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor in Jerusalem and Tokyo.
Good morning, early birds. I'm Madalika Sika. Currently, I'm a independent media consultant. I've had a career across television, radio, and digital first. I was at ABC News Television for a long time. Then I was at National Public Radio, and most recently at a digital first millennial focused site, completely different, called Mike. And thanks for being here this early hour.
By the way, that's ABC US, not ABC Australia.
Hello, everyone. I'm Yavuz Baydar. I entered journalism through public broadcasting in Sweden 40 years ago, and via BBC I went more into print, and I worked as news ombudsman, public editor for 15 years in Turkish domain, which was not an easy experience, quite nightmarish actually. And after the coup, immediately after the coup, I was forced to leave Turkey, and I'm in exile at the moment somewhere in Southern Europe. And I am a founding member also of an independent watchdog in Turkey, P24 platform for independent journalism.
Yavuz Baydar is an interesting story. Obviously, journalism in Turkey is in a critical state. And one of the reasons we wanted him on this panel is Turkey has been dealing with a political leader for the last decade and a half who shows some of the same populist demagogic tendencies as we're starting to see come out of Washington these days. So we thought that was a perspective that could be of value for us this morning. I want to start with Cameron, because what we have seen in the post-election era in the U.S. has been a re-engagement, a quantifiable one, of Americans with their news media. The New York Times is talking about record-breaking subscription rate increases. We're seeing a lot of that, and I guess given that so many media organizations, particularly on the television side, Cameron, have been somewhat contrite about their performances and some of their failings in their coverage of Trump, is this re-engagement, this revaluing of American journalism, something that American journalists deserve?
It's a good question, Richard. I think I'm not sure the frame is exact there. I think people, to some extent, are galvanized by what happened in the campaign because it was unexpected. There were so many surprising outcomes, and people struggled to find explanations for that, for why they couldn't really understand what was happening, for instance, in Republican politics or in Trump's showings in primaries. And that drove people to the sources of information that would help them understand what was going on. So, on the one hand, it's true that people are re-engaging with media. Organizations like mine are seeing surges in subscriptions, but even more interestingly, from my point of view, just a lot of public acclaim and even also private expressions of support and recognition, which is not something we're used to in the American media in recent decades. So that's positive, and I think it's also true that we failed to really scrutinize what was happening in the American economy and what was happening for working class and lower middle class Americans in the years sort of leading up to the political campaign. I think criticism of that is justifiable. We recognize that. I would just challenge you on one point, which is that I actually don't see a lot of contrition from certain media organizations, particularly in broadcast and cable television. I see some soul-searching that's happened. The New York Times publisher famously wrote something that sounded a lot like contrition. I think he was really also trying to promote the idea that the Times would be a valuable resource in the years ahead. So there was a marketing aspect to that I think was more forward-looking than backward-looking. So I think it's kind of a mixed bag. I mean, I think, do we deserve it? I think I would respond by saying we will do our best to deserve it in the future and going forward.
Madhulika, what do you see there? Because you're ex-mainstream media, you've spent time in new media, you're now consulting across presumably more than one platform, and you also spent time with, is it with NPR? Or
NPR.
National Public Radio, which is also under threat. What do you see in the way of re-engagement and whether that's something that American media will carry forward responsibly?
Well, I think the first thing that we should talk about is the American media. And I think that we tend to sort of lump everybody together. And I think that what this election campaign highlighted was the diversity of the media and the particular powerful roles that particular institutions have. If you only engaged in the campaign by watching cable TV, you would have had a very different perspective of what was happening in the campaign, or your knowledge about the candidates, than if you had been reading the New York Times or the Washington Post or ProPublica. So I think that, or a whole host of other organizations. So I think that that's what we have to think about going forward. I think it's funny, you know, people talked about television being so of the past, and we now have a president who is the TV president, who we know watches a lot of TV. The power of television is going to be even more important than it used to be before. So I think it's going to be an interesting challenge for all across the media. I agree with Cameron, you know, the idea that we should think about, well, how horribly wrong did we get things? I think there was actually a lot of really good reporting that was happening. I think that, you know, the ability for the media to look at sort of long-term trends like what the economy was doing to a lot of groups of people is really important. And I think the other thing is in a lot of mainstream media, there's a tendency to go with what you know and the rules that what, you know, this is how it happened, so used to happen, and this is how it's going to happen. Having been at a new media site that was focused on young people, where there was so much coverage of Bernie Sanders, and very early on. And
Sorry, you said there's so much coverage?
So much coverage of Bernie Sanders.
On CNN?
No, on new media, where I was at Mike. And that was sort of a revelation to me early on, and they saw something amongst their audience who really were responding to Bernie Sanders, which a lot of other news organizations didn't. So I think there's a real opportunity in the richness of the variety of media that we have. I think that a lot of people think many things have changed for American journalism as a result of the ascendancy of Donald Trump, but I'd like to pull us back to the things that have stayed the same. It's always been our job to hold an administration accountable, and that's not going to change for most of us. And I think that that's what we hang on to. And I think we should take pride in how much the Trump presidency has galvanized the American public one way or the other, whether it's supporting a subscription for the New York Times or the Washington Post, or for them to understand, oh, we have a judiciary and they can actually have an influence in what is happening in our country. As we've seen with the travel bans, you know, the fact that the arguments against the first travel ban were on audio, a crackly phone line that was broadcast live, that's pretty remarkable, and that gives me some hope that we're going to get some more civic engagement.
Madalika, you drew the distinction, which is very difficult to argue with, between print and television, and the influence of both. Yavuz has been covering a story for the last decade and a half in Turkey, and there you have a leader who has demonized the mainstream media, and when it comes to shutting down media and essentially forms of state censorship, he doesn't really care that much about print, does Erdogan. And I'm wondering whether you see a pattern there, a template, that I'm not suggesting that Donald Trump is a student of contemporary Turkish politics, but we've seen this elsewhere. We've seen it with Sisi in Egypt, Erdogan in Turkey, that print journalists can do as much good work as they can, but when you're up against the power of broadcast media, is this a model for leaders like this going forward? If it is, what do we do about it?
Well, certainly the main inspirational source is Vladimir Putin for most of the names that you mentioned. They do their calculations and copy-paste each other, watching and raising their awareness about the habits of the public. And in the domain of Russia, Turkey, there are very many similarities, as much as in Ukraine or Egypt, where, according to UNESCO, almost the entire population, up to 90%, get their news and opinion solely from TV, for free. And this has to do also with the rural population, literacy levels, etc. So when we look at the pattern of assault to the media in general in Turkish story in the past 7-8 years, which has crystallized before our eyes, you see the highest priority given to the TV other than print or social media. I would say TV, social media, and print in that order. And no matter what, the main target was to silence, to black out the screens. And we see it also in the case of Periscope now being targeted in social media, other than other social media tools lately, has to do with that as well. The vision is important, and Periscope was important because it was being used in the referendum campaign now intensely by the Kurdish segment of the Turkish society. They are rather tech-savvy and pretty tough activists as well. So this is the pattern of that continued, and if you look at the numbers in the private sphere, we have about 250 national, local, and regional TV channels, privately owned. And this pattern ended up with, as we speak today, with only one TV channel, and that is a partisan TV channel, mainly financed by the main opposition. Very tiny, half of this room, broadcasting somewhere from Istanbul, from an apartment flat. And also, little surprisingly, Murdoch-owned Fox TV in Turkish is trying to do something, under attack, but surviving, limping, but continuing. So out of 250, we have only 1.5 TV channels left in that domain.
Something I neglected to mention, I'd just like the panelists, don't wait for me to get in between you, jump in on each other's stuff. We're going to get to questions in the audience soon, so if we could have some hands up now, if anyone has a question, we'll get a microphone to you. We're going to ask you to wait for a while before you actually ask it, but I want to get the mic in place so we're not waiting and we can maintain some kind of pace here. Cameron, want to get back to, was that for us? Yeah. Probably not.
It's the pre-applause.
Yeah. I want to get to being with the Post, an organization that has had such an important place in the American journalistic landscape. If you look at the levels of trust that Americans have in their media today, I think it was Pew Research, I'm not sure, that came up with this figure, but somewhere in the low 30s So fewer than 35% of Americans say that they trust their media today, which is a free fall from the heady days of 1976, when that number maxed out somewhere in the high 70s, 2 years after some remarkable journalism occurred in your offices on the Watergate story. You have a president who knows this number, and you have a narrative around fake news. So people who want to do critical journalism of American politics and this administration are up against that. And they know that when they produce a story, however valid, that this administration has got a tendency to dismiss it as fake news. If it was 1950 and you wanted to raise your trust levels, your trust score with the American people, it would be difficult. In 2017, with the fake news narrative to fight, in addition to everything else, is it even possible?
I think the only thing that's possible is to do the work. I think we have an obligation to report as aggressively as we can. We see time and again that good reporting makes a difference. It has an impact. I mean, I spoke yesterday about some of the work we did on General Flynn. That resulted in his resignation, or really his firing. I feel like in this very complex media environment, should we not do the work? I mean, that's not an option, right? So we have to devote ourselves to the task at hand. We see a lot of support from readers, from subscribers, from others. We know that the work makes a difference, so we stay with it. That 30% number is lousy. I would venture to guess that it's going up, that people are putting more trust in their media sources. I think that one of the things, paradoxically, that's happened as a result of Trump and others referring to news as fake news is that readers are realizing that they need to make their own decisions about what's fake and what's real. And I think that redounds to the benefit of some established institutions who have a record of producing, for lack of a better term, real news. And I think that, there's some wide cognizance also among the platforms that some labeling is in order, some way to help news consumers decide between what's opinion, what's fact, what is well-sourced and what isn't well-sourced, would serve a role, would be a benefit to people. So, is it difficult? Yes. Can we do it? I think we can.
I want to talk a little bit about what's happening this week in Syria. We saw, first with the State of the Union address, this president who'd faced such intense criticism, even from some of the news organizations that gave him all that airtime during the election campaign and took all those phone calls. CNN comes to mind. The State of the Union occurs. He refers in his speech to a fallen soldier. I believe his wife was in the audience at Congress. And CNN immediately starts saying that this was his first presidential moment. He evokes images of conflicts overseas and the institution that is the U.S. military. This week we had the missile strike on Syria. I can't remember who it was who said last night that this was Donald Trump's first presidential moment. American media have shown a weakness, a tendency in the past, post 9/11, to when the tanks start rolling or the missiles start flying, to be a little overly reverential for their administrations, either in the run-up to the war. New York Times was quite contrite over their failings on the intel, anonymous sourcing. And what I see here, and I don't know, Madalika, maybe you can help us on this, is a slow, the first signs of perhaps a slide in that same direction, that tendency resurfacing. Do you see it the same way? Do you think that the U.S. media have learned a thing or two from post 9/11? Or do you think that the fact that it's Trump will have the media guarding against that tendency within themselves?
I think that, yet again, we're talking about television and its sort of outsized influence. I think that they will be on their guard because something else is going to happen the next day. I mean, the night of the president's address to Congress, I think that honeymoon lasted maybe less than a day. Some big Flynn news happened that week.
I would suggest that President Trump has a lot of first presidential moments.
Yes.
Because he tends to do something and then he tends to follow that up with a lot of really unpresidential moments. So I think there isn't a huge kind of swell of reverence building.
Right, and I
days.
think also with television, they are responding literally in the moment, and they have 24 hours a day to fill. And I'm not saying that should excuse them. And we're not here to discuss the merits of cable television versus other forms of journalism.
Well, we kind of are, actually.
All right. Well, I will say
are.
then, I think the person I think it was Fareed maybe who talked about
Fareed,
him being
first
presidential this week. I think that's what we've got to guard against, and the work that everyone else is doing will collectively make this something different. I mean, what's interesting to me about the coverage, and I've been here, so I haven't watched much of what's happening back home, but whenever a president takes a military action, people fall into their particular places. Many people feel, the partisan, we have to be bipartisan, beyond the water's edge, and there are others who fall into line with their political stances, and then people question motives, and some people don't. And I was struck, I was trying to remember a similar circumstance of a military action being taken at a time of domestic challenge, which is how a lot of people are interpreting this week's actions. And I had to dig in a little bit, but I did find something that made me think about this. Here's a quote. While there is clearly much more we need to learn about this attack and why it was ordered today, given the president's personal difficulties, it is legitimate to question the timing of this action. That's probably something you could have heard this week. That is actually from August 1998, after President Clinton did confess that he did, in fact, have a relationship with Monica Lewinsky. It was after the bombings of the embassies in Africa, and the U.S. launched strikes against Sudan and Afghanistan in response. And that quote came from Senator Dan Coates, who is currently Donald Trump's Director of National Intelligence. So a lot of stuff is new right now, but a lot of stuff is old. The thing that's new is the pace at which we have to respond now. I mean, Cameron and I were just talking about this last week. Usually, election campaign cycle, it's crazy, and then you kind of get back into a rhythm of something different. This is worse in spades. You have 4 or 5 legitimate news stories a day, and I think that is one of the biggest challenges for American journalism right now in covering politics. It is nuts. It's really, you come in the morning and the story that is the biggest story at 9 a.m. has been completely eclipsed by something else at noon. And then you've got to worry about what's happening in the evening when the president is at home and picking up the phone. And then, oh my God, it's Saturday morning. Well, it's still early in America. He hasn't tweeted yet this morning. And that kind of pace, you have to really guard against what it's going to do to how you conduct yourself and the work that you do in the newsrooms. And I think that's one of the real challenges that we're going to face in adapting to that kind of pace to do what it is we've always done, which is to cover administrations effectively and critically, using the real sense of the word critically.
With smaller newsrooms, too.
Yes, with smaller newsrooms and with a lot more self-publishers talking direct to audience, and that includes the President of the United States.
My quick insertion would be that I kept saying this, that we are now in the midst of House of Cards as a reality show, as juxtaposed and in multiplication all over the world. And this is something that we should be we should be aware of, and in the House of Cards at its most intense, not only taking place in only one country, but in several countries at the same time, and juxtaposed and sort of convergent.
Well, but also the idea of finding a conflict beyond your borders to distract from what's happening within. We're seeing that model in Turkey today. Erdogan going to diplomatic war with the Dutch, the Germans, when he's got his own electoral challenge to face. Same formula, different place, basically.
Right. As domestic factors play the I think main role here, as with Trump, whose popularity figures are falling dramatically, and the Flynn case, etc. The Congress, he feels the pressure, and for Erdogan, the same thing. But his nightmare is more than anything else the not disappearing corruption case, which has to do with. At the end of the line, Iranian breaking of the Iranian embargo at one side, and also the other file being having something to do with Al-Qaeda related businessman dating back to 2014. He managed to evaporate these cases, invalidate them by taking horns of the judiciary and put it down, judiciary, rule of law being non-existent, and then goes all the way, diplomatic warfare, creating and inventing enemies all the time. This is something that the media controlled by him directly through partisan proprietors, and also the others, conglomerates dependent on huge public contracts and public tenders, billions of dollars, not necessarily same in ideological line with Erdogan, but secular, but simply in it for the money and for greed. And this has created a spiraling down of the situation, and Erdogan is being one of the most successful Machiavellis of our time. He's winning, and probably he will continue winning.
I want to go to the audience now for questions. Where's the mic? We have a question here in the front row. And as soon as this question is done, are there any other questions? Can I see some hands now? So once we're done with this question, if you wouldn't mind just taking the mic to that gentleman after this, so we don't lose time in transition, but here to start. If you want to tell us your name or your affiliation, sometimes that helps.
My name is Beatriz Rios. I'm a freelance journalist. You have said, first of all, that depending on where you were following the news about the elections, TV, newspapers, your view of the situation was completely different. You said that you didn't manage to scrutinize the economic situation in the US. You said that only few media gave enough coverage to Bernie Sanders, and you have said that many people is only following the news through the TV. So I was wondering, first of all, do you think that this happened because you didn't manage to represent the people in the media, especially in the newspapers, and then that's why people went to TV and they were following completely different news, and that had some kind of impact in the elections? And if you think it did, what could you do to face this challenge in the years ahead, to try to re-engage these people into your news, into your media, to change the situation again? Thank you.
You want me to start?
So it's a complex question. I would say that we are being, just speaking for my own organization, we are being successful in engaging people in new ways. I don't think that's just a response to the political situation. I think that's a response to where our industry is. So it's, we have found it very necessary and actually very rewarding to experiment like crazy, to broaden the range of our storytelling. Our biggest expansion this year is the doubling of our video department. And and that's one of the things that we need to do as an organization to survive and even to prosper. And politics, isn't everything, right? It's not the only story we tell. Frankly, Donald Trump isn't everything. There are many other important stories in the world to tell right now, and in the U.S. So, I think we have a kind of institutional imperative to do what you're suggesting, right? Which is to reach out to readers, to find new ways of connecting with them, to bring them more into the process, frankly, of reporting, not just of consuming what we do. So, I like to think that we're having some success in doing that. And some of that is driven by a sense of not wanting to make up a little bit for some failings in the past. But as I said yesterday, news organizations can't keep trying to cover the story that they missed, right? You have to keep yourself open to what's happening now that needs attention, rather than looking in the rearview mirror about how you might have told the story of the working class in America more effectively.
And I think, it is a complicated question, and a lot of it has to do with consumption habits based on age demographics, and, cable television skews older and digital media skews younger. And I think the important charge for news organizations is to reach as many people as you can in as many different places as you can. So CNN isn't just a 24-hour cable channel, it has a very robust digital arm. The Washington Post now reaches tens of millions of people a month.
100. But
okay, I wasn't sure if it had gotten to 100 million.
Yeah.
And we've got to go where the people are, which is, I think, the fundamental shift in our business. When I used to work on a network television show, the only way you could get Nightline was to turn the TV on at 11:30 at night. Now, guess what? We have to go to you because you have choice, and technology has allowed you to time shift and all those other things. And I think any newsroom that relies on their one method of reaching audiences is going to be left behind.
Before we hear from this gentleman, who wants the microphone next? Hands? Anybody else? Let's go with, there's one at the back. Well, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I'm Steve Shear. I'm a correspondent with Reuters here in Italy. My question, there's been a lot of sort of dissecting what went wrong before the election, and I think a lot was probably just wishful thinking on the part of journalists covering the campaign, thinking that they couldn't imagine really Trump winning. And I also think that there's an aspect of sort of Hillary just was not the right candidate, and I think a lot of people don't see that. It's not just that the press didn't cover a certain income level or something like that. There was also sort of taking for granted that Hillary was going to be a candidate that could beat him. But what I wanted to ask was, now a lot of the same people who couldn't believe that Trump could win are thinking he can't last 4 years. How can we go 4 years with Trump, right? And I was wondering what you thought of that. Is there any sort of, the only way that it would possibly end, and it would be like Nixon, I think, when there's a crime that gets investigated, and then the president's put with his back against the wall. So what do you think could happen in the next 4 years that that could possibly see a Trump leaving, or it seems like something that's impossible, but there's a lot of talk about it.
Whatever happens, I bet you the Washington Post won't have the story to itself this time around, will it?
Yeah. We're not preparing for the early exit of President Trump. We're covering his administration as it is today. I think that just falls. That's just too speculative a question for me. I think that's better put to a political commentator. We have a lot to do, right? He's an unpredictable guy. He moves in different directions without warning. We have a lot to do to understand who's around him and what the backgrounds of those officials are, how they're likely to advise him. So there's a lot in front of us, and I think that's what we're focused on.
The subject of Bernie Sanders was raised earlier, and we did a piece on Sanders, I think mid-primaries, because he was drawing 16,000 students in Madison, Wisconsin, and getting 30 seconds worth of coverage over 8 months on CNN. Again, there's a difference between print and television in the way Sanders was covered, I think to a lesser degree than there was on Trump. But one of the people that we spoke to, who was trying, in a piece that we were trying to do to try to explain the disconnect between what was happening with the Sanders campaign on the ground and the lack of coverage that it was getting in U.S. mainstream media. Someone was saying, well, this word socialist, and we've talked a lot about demographics this morning, and someone was talking about the demographics of the modern American newsroom, that most people in that newsroom covering politics at a senior level would be my generation, 50s, 60s even. And to them, as this commentator put it, the word socialist evokes eras, takes them back to the Cold War. Whereas for millennials, as he put it, if they hear the S word, they're more likely to think of Norway or IKEA. And that there was that demographic. I mean, people talk a lot about the Rust Belt, disaffected voters that didn't get the coverage that perhaps they deserved. Again, and we're scrolling back here, and I know Cameron wants to look forward, which is why I'm putting the question to Madalika. But why, what do you think about that demographic dichotomy, and is that a way of explaining why someone who was attracting such big, large crowds, as the anti-establishment winds were blowing across America, that Trump was latching onto, didn't get the coverage?
I think that, as I said before, people tend to fall back into patterns of behavior. And I don't think it's about labels. I think it's about habits. I think it's about sourcing. I think it's about how people perceive a race to be evolving. I don't know any millennial who was really into Bernie Sanders who used the label socialist at all. They were
no, but other media commentators were, and they were using it almost as a disqualifier. I mean, Anderson Cooper on CNN saying, do you really think you can be elected as a socialist in the United States?
Yeah, except he was running as a Democrat.
But he said he was a socialist.
Yeah, he said he was a socialist, but, I don't think people think that sort of, academically about those labels. I just think he wasn't telegenic. I think he wasn't, he was just out there very slowly climbing up, and people were paying attention to other shiny objects, one of which was the Republican race that had, 100 people running for president. And nobody really paid attention to the Democratic race for the longest time because, yes, they thought it was a foregone conclusion. Clearly, the Democratic Party thought it was a foregone conclusion. And let's be honest, the Republican race early on, as soon as Donald Trump entered, became this crazy sideshow, which turned into a presidency. But that's how it was viewed. And even going back as fall of 2015, I was amazed at how interested people were in Trump overseas. I think he just galvanized the attention and sucked up oxygen in a way that when you're making decisions about where you're going and what you're covering, when you have a dozen Republican candidates to cover, and almost, that's where the attention was. So I think they just saw it too late. And you mentioned earlier smaller newsrooms. I mean, I think that's a huge issue at a time when in the 90s and even early 2000s, every single campaign would have embeds attached to them. You had to make decisions early on about where you were going to put your resources and divide them between a dozen plus Republican candidates. And, you didn't have eyes and ears on the ground in the way you might have done earlier.
There were two candidates on the Democratic side. I would argue that the reason that they didn't staff them wasn't because they were short on bodies, or even if they did, is because of the S word. I think conventional Washington media could not get its head around someone who attached the label to himself, socialist. I don't think they get their head around it. You and I see that. You and I see it. This one quite different.
Yeah, I do. I really do not think that is. I don't think there's any Washington newsroom, any other newsroom sitting around that is actively thinking, "Oh, socialist, no chance at all."
Well, you don't have to actively think it.
But even passively, I just disagree. I don't think that's the driving that's the driving force for why people quote missed the Bernie Sanders story early on.
We staffed the Sanders campaign. We covered the story aggressively. As to the S word, my older daughter's high school, which is a public high school in the District of Columbia, has a socialist club. So I think people are getting more used to that term. He was elected to the Senate more or less as a socialist. So
By the people of Vermont.
well, fair point. But still, it's not as toxic a word, I think, as you're imagining.
I agree. I just
Well,
think
in my
it's
world, it
something-
isn't toxic. I'm just suggesting
No,
that
in the U.S., I don't think it's as toxic a word in the U.S. as you're imagining.
And actually, during that period, there was a woman who ran for, I think it was Seattle City Council, who ran as a socialist and won.
And you've
So-
heard of her because of that. You've heard of her because she is an anomaly.
No, I heard of her because I think, actually, because she's Indian. But- no, I mean, it was interesting when you have someone who is not a Republican or a Democrat, you're going to hear about it.
And Richard, Barack Obama was a two-term president, and a lot of people thought of him as a socialist.
No, a lot of people called him a socialist. We have a
Hi.
question.
Yeah, my name is Chris Theodore. I publish The Reader in Southern California, which is a free printed magazine mailed to 390,000 people in Southern California. And my question is, why don't you think particularly the Washington Post, why doesn't it discuss nuclear weapons and the move, when you think about how important nuclear weapons are in terms of human civilization continuing, why isn't there more of an emphasis on an ongoing basis on nuclear weapons as well as militarism in general in terms of it within American culture? I'll just say this because I think that is actually the crux in terms of the American media's moral failing in general to not address what some people call America's addiction to war. And so I'm just curious as to what kind of pressures you face in kind of being able to communicate that from the position that you're in.
What about nuclear weapons?
Well, given its importance, why isn't there more coverage on nuclear weapons, such as the proposed treaty to ban that, make it illegal, and force the nuclear weapons possessing nations to enter into the negotiations that they promised to do so? But that's just the point. In general, why isn't there more coverage on nuclear weapons?
I think the short answer is because there's not much happening, right? I mean, it's not a story at the moment. There's not a tremendous amount of change, right? The news focuses on what's changing. And to your second point, we do spend a lot of time covering militarism. I mean, I might not put it quite that way, but we have covered a lot of wars in recent decades, and we spend a lot of time covering the impacts of those wars on the people who fight them, their families, and the countries where those wars are taking place. So I can't believe any reader of the Washington Post is not aware of how much the U.S. military has been engaged in recent years.
Oftentimes with journalism, if there are any other questions, we get some hands up. There's a couple at the back. Oftentimes in journalism, we try to get ahead of the story and try to see what's coming. And I'm wondering whether this president does seem to make that easy, Because if you want to get ahead of the story, all you got to do is watch Fox News, right? Because he watches Fox, and then he tweets it. And it seems that he also watches it on television. He doesn't watch it online, so he watches it in real time. And I'm wondering whether someone at the Washington Post has been assigned by the managing editor to watch Fox News all the time, just so they know what's coming down the pipe.
Well, you know, you might have seen the Times did this. The Times watched 18 hours of Fox and wrote a narrative piece about it. I'm not sure how revealing it was, but it was an interesting exercise. Yeah, I mean, we also try to get ahead of the story in more conventional ways. We try to talk to advisors and the people on the Hill that are engaged with the White House. I think we'll keep doing that. We are aware that he watches Fox, though.
I mean, but it's like, it's not like you don't know what's coming, right? I mean, in a way, it's kind of easier, isn't it? No, I know it's a ridiculous question, but it's a ridiculous situation.
I would go back to the bright, shiny object. Yes, people need to be paying attention to what the president is saying and doing, but to get ahead of the story, you have to make sure that you're covering all sorts of other things that are happening in buildings around Washington, in agencies, in cabinet offices. That's where you are going to get ahead of the story. And there will be people, everyone has beefed up their White House teams, and their White House will be covering what's happening at the White House, but the words coming out of the president's mouth or his reactions to what he sees on television, I would argue, are not necessarily all that's coming ahead. The kind of work that's been being done in the Justice Department, at the EPA, USDA, all these agencies who have a real impact on people's lives, that's where you're going to be watching the stories that are upcoming.
I want to take you up on that, but we're going to take a question from the back. Who's got the mic?
Hi, my name is Allie. I work for a local affiliate WSB in Atlanta. And I was just curious, I think in our newsroom there's been this sense of like, if there's a national story about Trump, to not touch it or to wait until Washington Post breaks it and then we cover it 3 days later. And I was just wondering what you think that local news stations' responsibility is to cover Trump, especially when we're right in those communities, and how we could do that better.
I would just pick up where Madhulika left off. I think actually one of our obligations now is to look at what's happening out of the spotlight. It is important to keep track of Fox News and what the president tweets. It's actually more important to kind of scrutinize what's happening at the agency and department level, and a lot of that will be felt first at the local level. So, where, you've seen news of the tremendous kind of reconstruction or deconstruction of the government that the White House proposes, and that's most clearly seen in the budget that the White House, budget proposal that the White House issued. So what does that mean at the local level in terms of, say, EPA enforcement of regulations and laws governing the environment? Can that be perceived, in Atlanta in a way that's meaningful and that would apply across the country? So that's what I would suggest, is to look for the quiet implementation or rollback of what the government does, and try to broaden that into national stories.
Yeah, I think I saw a great example of that yesterday, a story about the proposed cut in budgets for rail travel and how many places around the country were going to be very adversely impacted by not having access to rail travel, which that's a real people's, that's real people, real lives who are affected by something that is a line and a number on a piece of paper in Washington right now, but it's a whole lot more than that.
Quick question. My name is Militz. I'm from International Press Institute. Quick question. How concerned are you about the press freedom in the United States? I'm not talking about the business, number of subscribers, about missed stories, but about the opportunity to miss story or not. Opportunity and the space to do your job professionally. Is it shrinking? Do you expect more pressures? How concerned are you?
I'm sure.
You know, we're concerned. We were concerned under the Obama administration, right? Multiple leak investigations. You know, a lot of reporters who are, you know, have to spend an inordinate amount of time on source protection and on being able to communicate confidentially with people so that we don't put sources at risk. You know, it's a big deal. It takes up a lot of our time to try to compensate for that and to prepare for, you know, possible negative outcomes.
Is it getting worse?
Well, I think it's too soon to say that because he's only been in, you know, office for a couple of months. It was really tough under the Obama administration. So, you know, I guess it's possible to imagine that it could be worse. Right now it isn't, but it's early days.
We have a question at the back.
I have a question for Yavuz because I think the perspective from the outside is always very valuable. Yavuz, you're outside the eye of the storm in Turkey. Both Madhulika and Cameron are in the eye of a storm in the United States. I wonder, given your experience and watching US media from the distance that you have the privilege of doing, can you see missteps or traps or potholes that the United States media is liable to fall into or has already fallen into that you've seen happening in Turkey as well, where you have another leader of the country who is very anti-media?
I would first say, also related to the question, the big, huge difference is, of course, the heart of the matter is how robust the judiciary will be in terms of media freedom anywhere in the world. When it starts crumbling, you see the first effects on the media freedom, then I would go and say that in such times of rupture, such as, you know, unexpected rise and take over power by Trump in the U.S. and, you know, other surprises elsewhere like Brexit, etc., etc. In these times of rupture, I think the focus inevitably is to be on investigative journalism. And I think what I see on the US screen from outside is not enough of it. Because this is one of the, you know, this is the country where investigative journalism is the deepest and as a tradition very, very strong and inspiring for the others. And I'd see great opportunities as this experiment with Trump goes on in the US, that there will be people willing to leak disgruntled bureaucrats in the federal or local administrations. I think there should be focus on that as much as focus on how independent the judiciary will be. Other than that, I think the difference between Turkey and US is that there is great trust in print journalism, and that is doing rather well from outside, and there's still a very strong mainstream, independent mainstream, and followed, I think, quite intensely by the readers. So I would just say, you know, that these are the times that we need to have more cooperation on investigative journalism across the borders, as much as more keenness on the state of journalism across the borders. We need to build more strong united fronts to protect ourselves, because our profession is, I think, under the severest attack that I know of, you know, since it all began 200 or 300 years ago.
At the risk of ending this on a positive note, which doesn't really sit well with the cynical side of me, I did want to take up, elaborate on one point, Madhulika, that you made, which is the idea of getting out and covering the other buildings in Washington, D.C. that aren't the White House. We had that kerfuffle over a few news organizations being kicked out of the White House press briefing, not allowed to attend by this administration. Might that be a good thing? A little more distance. Is a little more distance something that's called for? I'd ask for something real quick from you both on this, and then we're going to have to wrap up because they're evicting us from this room.
I think that access to the White House by a daily briefing is important. I don't think it's either or. I think that's one component and an important part of working in Washington, and a responsibility that the White House has, frankly. They are government employees who represent the country, and this is their way to communicate with us. I believe that is one important part of coverage of the White House. But other reporting is important too, and that's why I do talk about going back to making sure you're covering other parts of the building. You know, let's not forget that Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward were not White House reporters. They were Metro reporters, and they were in a newsroom that saw the value of the work that they were doing. I don't think it's either or. I think it's both and.
You know, I think it's an essential mechanism of accountability that the leader of a government, typically his or her representative, is compelled to stand up every day and answer questions from a free media about what that government is doing. So access to the White House is sometimes derided, but it's also an essential activity, a responsibility that a government has to a public, which is to be compelled to answer questions every day. And so, you know, do we want to do both? Absolutely. Is it important that we be able to question authority on a consistent basis? It's also extremely important.
We're out of time. I want to thank Cameron Barr, Madhulika Sikka, and Yavuz Baidar. We've been talking about American journalism in the Trump era. Some of our guests will be milling about afterwards. If you have any more questions for them, feel free to ask. And thanks for being here.
Outcomes, and people struggled to find explanations for that, for why they couldn't really understand what was happening in, for instance, in Republican politics or in Trump's showings in primaries. And that drove people to the sources of information that would help them understand what was going on. So, you know, on the one hand, it's true that people are re-engaging with media. Organizations like mine are seeing surges in subscriptions, but even more interestingly, from my point of view, just a lot of public acclaim and even also private expressions of support and recognition, which is not something we're used to in the American media in recent decades. So that's positive, and I think it's also true that we failed to really scrutinize what was happening in the American economy and what was happening for working class and lower middle class Americans in the years sort of leading up to the political campaign. I think criticism of that is justifiable. We recognize that. I would just challenge you on one point, which is that I actually don't see a lot of contrition from certain media organizations, particularly in broadcast and cable television.
Had a career across television, radio, and digital first. I was at ABC News Television for a long time. Then I was at National Public Radio, and most recently at a digital first millennial focused site, completely different, called Mike. And thanks for being here this early hour.
By the way, that's ABC US, not ABC Australia.
Hello, everyone. I'm Yavuz Baidar. I entered journalism through public broadcasting in Sweden 40 years ago, and via BBC I went more into print, and I worked as news ombudsman, public editor for 15 years in Turkish domain, which was not an easy experience, quite nightmarish actually. And after the coup, immediately after the coup, I was forced to leave Turkey, and I'm in exile at the moment somewhere in southern Europe. And I am a founding member also of an independent watchdog in Turkey, P24 platform for independent journalism.
Yavuz Baidar is an interesting story. Obviously, journalism in Turkey is in a critical state, And one of the reasons we wanted him on this panel is Turkey has been dealing with a political leader for the last decade and a half who shows some of the same Thank you for making the effort for the early Saturday morning panel. We know it's not easy. My name is Richard Gisbert. I host a program on Al Jazeera English called The Listening Post. We cover media in all its forms. We've been doing the program since 2006, so we're 10 years into it now. And the Trump story, as a political story goes, with a media angle, it doesn't get any better than that. The title of this morning's session is American Journalism in the Trump Era. We have three very interesting and well-placed panelists today to help us through this. I'm going to get each of them to introduce themselves, starting with Cameron on my far left.
Good morning. I'm Cameron Barr. I'm managing editor at the Washington Post. Been at the Post
Push
for
the
about,
button.
It's on.
Yeah, I've been at the Post for about 13 years. Before that, I was a foreign correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor in Jerusalem and Tokyo.
Good morning, early birds. I'm Madalika Sika. Currently, I'm a independent media consultant.
Populist, demagogic tendencies, as we're starting to see come out of Washington these days. So we thought that was a perspective that could be of value for us this morning. I want to start with Cameron, because what we have seen in the post-election era in the U.S. has been a re-engagement, a quantifiable one, of Americans with their news media. The New York Times is talking about record-breaking subscription rate increases. We're seeing a lot of that, and I guess given that so many media organizations, particularly on the television side, Cameron, have been somewhat contrite about their performances and some of their failings in their coverage of Trump, is this re-engagement, this revaluing of American journalism, something that American journalists deserve?
It's a good question, Richard. You know, I think I'm not sure the frame is exact there. You know, I think people, to some extent, are galvanized by what happened in the campaign because it was unexpected. There were so many surprises. I see some soul-searching that's happened. The New York Times publisher famously wrote something that sounded a lot like contrition. I think he was really also trying to promote the idea that the Times would be a valuable resource in the years ahead. So there was a marketing aspect to that I think was more forward-looking than backward-looking. So I think it's kind of a mixed bag. I mean, I think, do we deserve it? I think I would respond by saying we will do our best to deserve it in the future and going forward.
Madalika, what do you see there? Because you're ex-mainstream media, you've spent time in new media, you're now consulting across presumably more than one platform. And you also spent time with, is it with NPR? Or
NPR.
National Public Radio, which is also under threat. What do you see in the way of re-engagement and whether that's something that American media will carry forward responsibly?
Well, I think the first thing that we should talk about is the American media. And I think that we tend to sort of lump everybody together. And I think that what this election campaign highlighted was the diversity of the media and the particular powerful roles that particular institutions have.